This story was something that shocked me to the core when I had heard it. I'm telling the story of what happened to one of my closest friends when they went away on a trip and experienced something truly horrifying. George and his very recent partner, Harriet, wanted to get away. They were the type to celebrate every little moment. And with her securing a job within a bank, they both wanted a little alone time before life gets back on top of them once again. Thankfully, George worked from home, committing to very long hours, which permitted him to take a break almost when he felt like. Packing up their bags with big smiles on their faces, they headed on out the front door and arrived at the airport. Living in Utah, they had to fly from Salt Lake to LAX, and then from LAX down to Panama, where they were going to spend a nice long week away sipping on cocktails and catching a tan on the beach. And for the most part, everything went off swimmingly. The flights were on time. The overnight flight down from LAX was blissful, as they were able to get plenty of rest. And then, landing in Panama, the heat was just the most refreshing feeling they had felt as they stepped off the plane and headed on out to a taxi that took them to the villa that they had acquired. It was situated in a gated community, and quickly getting changed into their bathing suits, George took the opportunity to run and jump into their private pool, whilst Harriet had looked around the villa more thoroughly before joining him. Around an hour into being at the villa and finally being able to settle down, they get a knock on the front door. Totally unexpected, Harriet got up and went off to go and answer it, whilst George stopped swimming and listened intently. From what could be heard, another woman, a resident of another villa, wanted to drop around a welcoming gift and to offer any help should they ever need it. It was all very pleasant. The gift box was brought out by the swimming pool, and its contents weren't what they were expecting. It contained some clothing and some money covered by some fruit scattered along top. Confused, George set about handing it back, but Harriet didn't know what villa she had lived in, and neither of them felt truly comfortable with this basket. They both agreed just to push it aside, sitting it next to the front door. That way, if they ever spot the woman again, then they can just quickly hand it on back. Days went by even better. The beaches were absolutely stunning. The locals they came across were friendly, and the food was just to die for. The thought of coming back home was something that hadn't entered their minds at all. But 2 nights before they were due to leave, George had said he wanted to go and find this woman to give the basket back. Harriet was a little confused. It was very late at night, somewhere around 10, but George was adamant. He gave Harriet a kiss on the cheek and told her that he wouldn't be long, and to carry on watching the movie and then heading on out the front door. George went from door to door, knocking and speaking to people he had seen around now and again, but had never spoke to on a more personal level. Nobody had seen this woman, or had even spoken to her. It was all a bit confusing. George was dumbfounded. Scratching his head, he knew there was a few more villas towards the entrance of the gated community, but being late, he really dwelled about walking down that far. Meanwhile, Harriet felt a little weird, but nonetheless sat back down and watched the entire rest of the movie. In her mind, the movie wasn't all that great, and she quickly found herself cleaning up and making sure everything was back fresh and clean. Finishing up in the kitchen, putting the remaining of the dishes back into the cupboard, Harriet noticed that the time was coming up to midnight, and George still hadn't returned home. Being a little more worried, Harriet grabbed hold of her phone and gave George a call, but he never answered. Panicking slightly, she called a few more times, but still no answer. The reason for the answer became very clear when she walked back into the living room and spotted his phone sitting on a TV stand, silenced. Confused about what to do now, Harriet opened up the door and looked around trying to see if George was anywhere close by, but he wasn't. Then Harriet spots the same woman who had given the basket. She was walking a small dog. Excuse me, she calls out, running on over, making sure she had her keys in her pocket and closing the front door behind her. Both women started to converse about where George was and if he had given her the basket back as it contained money. But this woman just nodded a no and asked Harriet to come with her, and maybe George would eventually turn up. To put into perspective, this gated community was spread out. It was very large, and there were many villas to be knocking upon. George was firmly still on the prowl though, but more reserved about knocking on people's doors. Many had kept him talking endlessly, and being polite, he of course obliged. But there were still a few villas left to knock on. But he had this feeling it was way too late to be knocking on anyone's door. So taking that final big sigh of exhaustion, George turned around and headed on back home. Till when he got home, defeated, calling out for a little comfort from Harriet, he noticed he got no response. Grabbing his phone, he called her wondering where she was, but her phone kept on ringing and ringing, only to be spotted by him sitting on the sofa. Wondering if she had gone to bed, George ran up the stairs, but every room was empty. Harriet was nowhere to be seen. At this point, he knew she must have gone out looking for him, as he must have realized he was gone for longer than what he thought. Knowing she wasn't in the direction of where he came from, at least that's what he felt most comfortable acknowledging, he set off down to his left, towards many of the villas he had not noticed before. Most of their lights were off, so he spent the next few hours circling the perimeter, calling out, but on a more lower frequency, trying not to disturb other people who too were trying to enjoy their holiday. But there was never any response. In fact, Harriet had not turned up for the remainder of the trip. Feeling extremely uneasy and terrified, George basically remained in Panama looking for his partner. The police said they would look into things, but he never expected them to do much. Upon returning back to the villa though, he was greeted by a woman. She had long black hair, smaller than he, somewhere around 5'4", and was slim, fairly dressed. She greeted herself as Hannah. They shook hands and they got quite acquainted. He explained his situation, and she explained that she was a local. Her English wasn't amazing, but she could speak the local language extremely well, so she could help. George was feeling hopeful that somebody was willing to help him. They knocked on every villa door. Nobody had seen her though, and even stepped onto the streets handing out flyers and asking if locals had spotted Harriet, showing a photo of George and Harriet together from a different trip. But there was no luck. Having extended this week-long holiday to 2 weeks, money was becoming hard to come by, and feeling exhausted, George and Hannah headed on back to her home. She made him a nice cold juice drink, very refreshing, and they spoke for hours about what to do next. But there weren't many options left to do. Resources had dried up, and George was left knowing in just 2 days he would have to return home alone, and not knowing what had happened to Harriet. That night just didn't go down well with George. He got himself drunk, collapsed on the sofa, lost and feeling empty inside. Harriet was somebody he knew he wanted to marry very soon. He had even bought a ring and was going to propose on the last night they had together in Panama. The next day didn't go any better either. There was nothing more to be done. And doing nothing else but drinking again, George furiously headed on over to the police department and angry started shouting, bellowing, only wanting someone to actually help. When another female officer, one in which he hadn't met before, came on over and sat with him, listening to him drunkenly tell the officer everything that has happened and everything that hasn't been done to help. He also spoke about Hannah, praising her for being the only person who actually stepped out with him and searched. But the officer sat back in his seat upon hearing about this Hannah. The officer in question, Detective Castillo, had been working on George's case ever since he came in, and she had extensively gone over every single resident in that gated community, and not one of them was called Hannah. It wasn't much to go on, but Castillo leaned back in and fished for more information about this Hannah. George, though, barely able to stand, said what she looked like, where she lived, and continued speaking praise of her. Castillo immediately picked up George with the help of another officer and carried him off to an empty bench just to make sure he remained safe and sobered up, without him too going getting lost. Castillo and another officer went off to the villa. When they arrived back, not an hour later, Hannah was in handcuffs, and that was the last time George had seen her or Harriet again. Here's what happened. On the night Harriet went out to find George, it was Hannah who she came across. They headed on back to one of the villas tucked away almost out of sight from everyone else. They had made some jokes. Harriet petted the dog, and Hannah brought her a refreshing drink. But this wasn't just any drink. It had been spiked. Within minutes, Hannah slumped back on the sofa, having just ingested a large amount of Rohypnol. She knew she hadn't felt normal, but for some reason wasn't able to move. It was in this moment that Harriet knew she had been spiked. Hannah started whistling to herself and proceeded to start stabbing her all over her body. Harriet, unable to move due to being paralyzed, was fully awake and fully aware of what was happening. The true terror and fear she felt in those final moments would have been truly devastating. Eventually, she died, but Hannah wasn't done with her body just yet. She proceeded to cut off her limbs, chucking them to the ground, where her dog proceeded to start eating her. In her own sick fantasy, Hannah danced around her home before finally cleaning everything up, putting Harriet in black bags and hiding them away, waiting for the right time to get rid of her body. But when she came across George, Hannah had the sick idea of getting him back to hers, knowing that she had brutally killed and butchered someone he loved, and she was in black bags not a few feet from where he would eventually sit. Not expecting George to drunkenly go to the police though, when Castillo arrived at the home, Hannah was in the process of putting Harriet in her car when this foul stench loomed around the car. That was when both Castillo and the other officer drew their weapons and knew something bad was going on. The deputy officer held Hannah at gunpoint, whilst Castillo searched the bags and found the butchered body of Harriet. Hannah was quickly arrested, and it was said that she had a look of genuine happiness whilst getting handcuffs being put on her. As for George, he remained in the police department for a few hours more afterwards, where Castillo sat with him and said about what had happened with Hannah, providing a full confession moment before. Being unable to accept what had happened, and feeling like he was partially to blame for whatever had happened, George attempted to commit suicide back home in Utah. Thankfully, his mother had randomly come around, spotting that this was happening, and saved him. To this day, George is thankfully in a much better place mentally, due to a lot of therapy and support from not only his family, but Harriet's, who he still remains close to, keeping the engagement ring close to his heart.